Hi, welcome to my channel Cloud with Girish. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create an AWS Http API and invoke a get method to get state name based on state code passed as parameter. I will use a Lambda function to process the state code and look up for state name. API get method is integrated with this Lambda function using API gateway. I will test the API endpoint using Postman extension in VSCode. If you have not watched part 1 of this workshop for Postman extension, link is in the description. Please do watch. Let's get started. Go to AWS console and search for Lambda function. Then click on create function. Select author from scratch, enter function name, select runtime as Python 3.10. I'm going to use Python for this function, hence I'm selecting the runtime as Python. If you are going to use any other language like Node or Java, please select the appropriate runtime. Click on create function. Lambda function got created. Let's review the code. This is the default code that AWS has created. This returns a hello message when invoked. However, we are not going to use this code. We will use our own code for that function. Lambda function has been created. Let's create HTTP API now. Click on create API from API gateway. Select HTTP API and click on build. Please note we are using the new API gateway interface. AWS has redesigned the API gateway console to make it easier to use. The old console will be retired soon. Next, let's add integration as Lambda. Select get state name Lambda function as integration. This is the same function that we just developed and deployed. Next, provide API name. We're going to call this API as get state API. Click on next. Next, we can configure routes. It's optional. It creates a resource path. We will leave it as default. Click on next. HTTP API has a default stage name and auto deploy enabled. If you want, you can create a different stage like development, testing, UAT, prod. You can also control auto deploy, enable or disable. We'll leave it as default. Let's click on next. It will show us a screen to review and create the API. We're gonna click on create. Next, we will look at our deploy stage from left navbar. This will give us the invoke URL. Let's get the invoke URL from the stages screen. Let's go back to VS Code and click on Postman extension. Use the Postman to invoke the API URL. We will pass the state code as parameter. Click on send. Review the response received by the API. You have a valid HTTP API response. You can change the state code and watch for a different response. Let's see it in action. I'm going to open my VS Code and we will take this API endpoint. We will use this in Postman extension and we will see if we're getting a response back. I have started my VS Code. Let's go to Postman extension. We will do a new HTTP request. We have our endpoint that we have just created. Let's hit on send, and we have our response back. If we change our state code, we should see an updated response, and we do. HTTP API creation and validation using Postman extension. Both have been successfully completed. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I'm working on some other interesting content on various AWS topics. These will be posted soon. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.